Picture a town buried alive in white, every chimney cold, every fire dead. Inside those frozen houses, people burn their own chairs, their own tables, anything that might hold off the dark a little longer, and it is not enough. A lawman drags himself through the storm, doing the arithmetic no man wants to do, the math of cold and time and bodies. The numbers come out wrong every single time. Then he turns a corner. And he stops. Because there, at the edge of the dying town, behind a line of frozen pines, one column of smoke rises, black, thick, steady, refusing to bend, even as the wind tears everything else apart, one fire still burning, while the whole world freezes, and the woman who built it was the very one they tried to stop. The wind came on the seventh night the way the cruelest things always come. Without warning, it did not build slowly. It did not announce itself with a far-off moan or a tightening in the air that a person might feel in their bones. It simply arrived, all at once, as though some great door had been thrown open at the top of the world, and everything cold and dark and merciless had come pouring through. A man moved through that storm like a ghost in a town he no longer knew. He had walked for hours. His name was Len Cole, and for 20 years he had kept the peace in the little mountain town of Cedar Hollow. He knew every street here, every storefront, every crooked fence post, but not tonight. Tonight the snow had buried the lower windows. The street itself had ceased to exist. There was only white and wind, and the dark shapes of buildings pressing up through the storm like sunken ships. He had just come from the Pike place. Old Walter Pike, 74 years old, lay under every blanket the house could offer. His fireplace had gone cold. The man could tell by the frost creeping across the inside of the window, by the stillness in that room that was not the stillness of sleep. He had covered the old man with his own coat. He did not know if it would matter. He had no dry wood to leave behind. None. And that was the truth no lawman could arrest his way around. There was no dry wood left in this town. The proud stacks the families had built through autumn, those neat towers of split timber they had pointed to with such satisfaction, were buried now under feet of frozen snow. What little anyone could dig out was green or wet, or both. And it burned the way wet things burn, more smoke than heat, more frustration than warmth. He had watched a man carry a dining chair to the fire that afternoon. He had seen children huddled together in one bed, their breath rising visible in the air of their own home. He had done the arithmetic no one ever wants to do, and the numbers came out wrong every single time. Then he turned a corner, and he stopped. He stopped because of smoke, not the pale, thin, apologetic wisps that rose from the other chimneys of Cedar Hollow. Those gray threads the wind tore apart before they could climb 10 feet. This was different, from a small cabin at the far edge of town, the one set back from the road behind a line of old pines. Smoke rose in a column that was black and thick and absolutely steady. The wind that had erased everything else seemed to bend around it, as though the fire below were simply too strong to argue with. He knew that cabin. He had stood at the edge of a hole in its yard months before and handed a young widow a folded piece of paper. He had told her, in the gentlest words he could find, that perhaps she ought to reconsider what she was doing. He had thought, back then, that grief had twisted her into something strange. Now he stood in the storm and looked at that column of smoke, holding itself against the wind like a flag that refused to fall, and something began to move in the chest of Len Cole. Something he did not yet have the courage to name. He began to walk toward the light. But to understand that light, you have to go back to a spring that smelled of pine and melting snow and wet earth. Back to the months before the storm, when no one in Cedar Hollow believed a single thing that cabin would come to mean. Back to a woman standing alone in front of a woodpile that was far too small. Her name was Ada Hale. She was 25 years old, and she was trying very hard to keep her face still. There was not much to keep still about. The pile in front of her was a sad little heap of half-rotted logs, a few strips of bark, and 2 chunks of green wood, so fresh they had already grown a fuzz of pale mold along the bottom. This was what was left. What was left after a winter that had taken more than its share. A winter that had taken Caleb. She did not think about Caleb directly. In the months since he was gone, she had learned that thinking about him directly was like looking at the sun. You could do it for a moment, but it cost you. And it left marks behind your eyes that made everything else harder to see. So she looked at the woodpile instead, and she thought about numbers. 24 logs at most, enough for 3 weeks of real cold. Maybe, if nothing went wrong. If the wood was dry enough to burn, which several pieces clearly were not. She was 25 years old. She was alone, in a cabin miles from the nearest town of any size, and she had a mountain winter to survive. It is not enough. The voice came from behind her. An old woman stepped forward and came to stand beside her. Ruth Hale, 70 years old. The decades showed in the deep lines of her face, and in the way she held one hand slightly curled, even when it held nothing. An old injury that had never quite healed. But her eyes were the same as they had always been. Dark, clear, sharp enough that when she looked at you, you felt she was reading something written on the inside of your skull. She did not say, "Poor dear." She did not say, "We will manage somehow." She looked at the woodpile the same way her daughter did, with the flat, honest gaze of someone measuring a problem. "The signs this year," she said quietly. "I have not seen coats this thick on the woolly caterpillars in 40 years. The squirrels along the ridge started hiding their stores 3 weeks early." She paused. "The air drops the way my father taught me to read it." She let the silence sit. "This winter will not be kind to anyone who is not ready for it." "Then we cut what we can," Ada said. "It is all we can do." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, the way a river changes when it nears something deep. "Cutting is only half of it." Ada turned to look at her. "The wood must be dry," the old woman went on. "Truly dry. Green wood is a cruelty. It promises heat and gives you smoke." She looked out toward the dark line of trees to the north, and something moved across her face that her daughter could not quite read. "My father knew how to solve this. He never walked into a winter afraid." Ada had heard pieces of this before, fragments. A name dropped, then carefully not explained. She had always sensed a boundary there, the way you sense a fence in the dark, just before you walk into it. "Your grandfather," Ruth said. "Elias Crane." Ada waited. "He built something on this land, before you were born, before I ever left to marry." The old woman drew a slow breath. A tunnel, underground, lined with timber, with shelves cut into the walls and small shafts running up to the surface to let the damp air escape. Her voice was steady, but something beneath it was not. The earth holds a constant warmth, down deep. The water inside green wood is drawn out of it slowly, more completely than any summer sun could ever manage. After a few months in that tunnel, the wood was as dry as wood can be, and it was safe, hidden under the snow instead of buried by it. Ada looked down at the ground beside the cabin. The roots of the old pines wound through the soil in every direction, thick as a man's wrist. "That is an enormous amount of work," she said carefully, "for 2 people. Yes, it would take most of the summer. And you are telling me he built one of these with his own hands." With his own hands, Ruth's voice did not waver. "He used to say the world gives you what you need to survive, but it rarely makes it easy to reach." Ada looked at her own hands. The palms were already rough from years of farm work, the fingertips hard with callus. But there was a difference between hands that mended fences and tended a garden, and hands that dug 50 feet of tunnel through packed clay and root-threaded earth. "Mother," she said, "why have I never met him?" The question came out before she could stop it, pulled up by something in the way Ruth had said the name. The particular weight of a word set carefully on a shelf and not touched for a very long time. Ruth did not answer right away. She looked out toward the northern trees, and the silence stretched on so long that Ada began to think she had crossed a line she had not known was there. When the old woman finally spoke, her voice was the voice of someone who had decided, after decades, that the time for this particular silence was finally over. "He built his tunnel a long time ago," Ruth said, "and it worked exactly as he promised it would. Then came the worst winter this valley had ever known. The neighbors burned their furniture to stay alive." She stopped. "We had a fire every single night, warm, steady, through all of it." She paused, and then someone told the county authorities that the tunnel was a hiding place, a place for smuggled goods. Ada went very still. "There was no evidence," Ruth said, "because there was nothing to find. But it did not matter. There did not need to be evidence. There only needed to be the accusation, and the right person to make it." "What happened to him?" "He was called a danger to the town. He was pressured to leave." The old woman's voice did not break, but it flattened, the way a road flattens when it crosses something hard underneath. "He went away to a city, alone, and he died there not long after." She was quiet. "I was just a girl." Ada stood without moving. "Who made the accusation?" she asked softly. Ruth looked at her daughter for a long moment. "I have my suspicions," she said. "I have held them a very long time, without proof." She turned back toward the trees. "We will dig first. That answer can wait." And there was something in the way she said it, a kind of deliberate quiet, that told Ada this was not avoidance. It was a choice that had cost something to keep, and one her mother had decided, for reasons not yet clear, to keep a little longer. "Show me where to begin," Ada said. The work started the next morning before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. The ground fought her from the very first stroke. The top layer of soil gave easily enough, soft, crumbling, damp with spring. But 6 inches down, the real earth showed itself. Dense clay, packed tight around river stones, and the thick, iron-hard roots of trees that had stood here for 100 years. The roots did not yield to the blade of the pickaxe. They had to be found, traced, cut through one at a time with a hand axe, each one its own small battle, its own separate argument with the ground. Her shoulders began to ache on the first afternoon. By the third day, the ache had settled into something deeper, a soreness that lived below the muscle and never fully let go, even at night. Her hands blistered, healed to callus, blistered again somewhere new. And through it all, the old woman sat on a fallen log at the edge of the work. Ruth could not swing the pickaxe. Her hands would not allow it. But she sharpened the blades in long, steady strokes. She kept 2 buckets of cold water close. She watched the angle of the sun and told her daughter when to drink, when to rest, when the heat had grown too much. She could not do the digging, but she was the reason the digging kept going. "Do not fight the stone," she said one morning, watching Ada drive the point of the pick again and again into a rock the size of a loaf of bread. "Persuade it. Find the grain. Work with it. Stone does not have a grain." "Everything has a grain," Ruth said. "You will find it." And she did. Not that day, but 2 days later, coming at the same kind of rock from a different angle, she felt it split along a seam she had never been able to see. The neighbors noticed, of course. The first wagon slowed out of plain curiosity. Then they slowed out of that particular fascination people feel watching someone do something that looks like a mistake. By the 3rd week, Ada had the sense that her little project had become a subject of conversation in places she would never be invited, and that the conversation was not kind. She heard the whispers carried on the wind from the road. A widow, half mad with grief, digging a grave in her own yard. Her mother too old to stop her, or too foolish to try. She let them talk. She drove the point of the pick into the earth. She levered loose a chunk of clay. She dropped it into the bucket. And she did it again, and again, and again. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not shout or argue or weep where others can see. It simply rises before the sun, picks up the tool, and keeps moving. Long after everyone watching has decided it is pointless. That was the strength taking shape in Ada Hale that spring. One blistered handful of earth at a time. It was near the end of one long afternoon, with the light going gold and low through the pines, that she first became aware of someone watching. Not from the road, not in a wagon, a small figure, standing at the far edge of the property, near the fence line. A girl, perhaps 14 years old, in a plain blue dress, holding a small notebook against her chest. Ada had half seen her before, at the edge of her vision. Now she straightened and looked directly. The girl did not run. She did not look the way people look when they are gathering material for gossip. She watched the way someone watches when they are trying to understand how a thing works. Her pencil moved across the page without her eyes ever leaving the trench. For a long moment, the woman in the hole and the girl at the fence simply looked at each other. Then Ada bent and went back to work. She did not yet know the girl's name. She did not yet know that the child had been coming for days, or that the notebook held pages of careful drawings and measurements and questions her own father had told her she had no business asking. She knew only this, that somehow, in a town that had already turned its back, one small pair of eyes was still watching, still curious, still refusing to look away. That evening, Ada sat on the cabin step and looked at her hands in the fading light. They were not the hands she had started with. They were harder now, marked, changed. The woodpile still sat there, small and sad in the corner of the yard, and beside it now, a hole, shallow still, a scratch in the surface of a job that would swallow the whole summer. The old woman came and sat beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke. "They think I have lost my mind," Ada said at last. Not bitter, just plain. "They thought the same of my father," Ruth said, "right up until the winter that proved him right." Ada was quiet. Somewhere out past the trees, the day was letting go of its last light, and the cold came creeping back, the way it always did, reminding them both of what was coming. "He never finished saying what he wanted to say," Ruth murmured, almost to herself. There was always more he meant to do. She turned and looked at her daughter, and in her dark, clear eyes, there was something that was not quite hope, but stronger than hope, older than it. "Finish it," she said, "not for them, not even for me. Finish it because it is worth finishing, and because you are the one who is here." Ada looked at the small, raw hole in the earth, and then she looked north, toward the dark line of trees where a man she had never met had once stood, believing in something no one else could see. She did not cry. She did something quieter than crying, and in some ways much harder. She stood up. She picked up the pickaxe, and in the last gray light of that long spring day, she went back to the hole, and she began again. She did not know yet about the man who would come to threaten her. She did not know about the wall that would come down, or the name hidden in an old box, or the night the whole town would stand at her door, begging for the warmth they had mocked her for building. She knew only the weight of the tool in her hands, and the cold, patient promise of the winter still to come. The summer came on slow and bright, the way mountain summers do, and the hole in the yard became a trench. The trench became something deeper. Week after week, Ada Hale went down into the earth, and the earth gave up its ground one stubborn inch at a time. Her body changed in those weeks. The softness that grief and long stillness had left in her burned away. Her shoulders grew broad and certain. Her hands, once smooth where they had held a needle or a kitchen spoon, grew hard and sure, as though the digging were not only making a passage in the ground, but remaking the woman who dug it. She learned the work the way a person learns a language, not all at once, but word by word, until one day you wake and realize you have begun to think in it. She learned how the clay behaved when it was wet, and how it cracked when it dried in the sun. She learned which roots could be cut clean in a single stroke, and which had to be coaxed and worried loose like a stubborn tooth. She learned the difference between a tired ache, the kind that meant rest a while, and a sharp one, the kind that meant stop now, before you do something you cannot undo. Through all of it, the old woman kept her place on the log at the edge of the work. "Slow," she would say, when Ada swung too hard, too fast, trying to beat the earth into giving up. "You are not fighting it. You are asking it. Ask slower." And Ada, who had spent her whole life being told to hurry, learned at last what it meant to go slow on purpose, to last. By now the town had stopped merely watching. The curiosity had hardened into something with an edge to it, and one bright afternoon, that edge arrived in the shape of a wagon, carrying the largest man in the valley. His wagon raised a small cloud of dust on the dry road, and it slowed, and it stopped. He was a large man, broad across the chest, thick through the arms, with the particular ease of someone who had been right about things, professionally, for a very long time. He wore a good coat for an ordinary day. He had the look of a man who was used to being the largest presence in any space he entered. His name was Calvin Brandt. He ran the biggest lumber operation in the whole valley. He had opinions about wood the way a preacher has opinions about scripture, except that to him, they were not opinions at all. They were facts, settled, finished, beyond the reach of any argument. And they were certainly not open to correction from a young widow standing waist deep in a hole. He did not climb down from the wagon. He simply looked down into the trench where Ada worked, his thick forearms resting on the side rail, the reins loose in his hands. "Hale," he said, "not Mrs. Hale, just the surname, flat. The way you address someone you do not consider your equal." Ada looked up, squinting against the hard afternoon light. She did not climb out. She did not put down the tool. "Mr. Brandt," she said, "you are digging a cellar." It was not a question. "To store and dry firewood," she answered. Something moved across the big man's face. It might have been amusement. It might have been pity. With certain kinds of men, the two look almost exactly the same. "Wood needs air," he said, slow and patient, as though explaining a simple thing to a slow child. "Wood needs sun. You stack it high. You leave good gaps for the wind to pass through. And after a season in the open, you have firewood." He shook his head. "You bury it in a hole in the ground, in the wet and the dark. And you know what you get?" He let the question hang in the warm air. "Rot," he said. "Mold. A pit full of ruined wood and a whole summer thrown away." He leaned a little forward. "I have been in this business 30 years, Hale. I am not guessing. I am telling you, as a fact, what is going to happen." Ada held his gaze. She did not flinch. She did not argue. She let a beat of silence pass, the way the old woman had taught her, and then she said simply, "I appreciate the advice." And she turned back to the wall of clay and went on digging. For a long moment, Calvin Brandt did not move. She could feel him up there. The particular weight of a man who is not at all used to being answered with 3 small words and a turned back. A man who had come expecting an argument he would win, and found instead a wall he could not push against. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, lower, quieter, the performance gone out of it, and because of that, far more dangerous. "Your husband died from his own stubbornness," he said. The words landed in the trench like a stone dropped from a height. That trail he insisted on taking, when every man with sense told him the snow above it was unsteady, ready to slide. He paused and let it sit. He would not listen, and it cost him everything. Another pause. "Do not follow him down that same road, Hale." Ada's hands tightened on the handle of the pickaxe until the knuckles went pale. She did not look up. She would not give him that. She would not give him the sight of her face. She drove the point of the pick into the earth. She levered loose a chunk of heavy clay. She lifted it. She dropped it into the bucket. The sound of it landing was the only answer she gave him. She heard him wait. She heard the long silence of a man deciding the conversation was over because he had decided it was. And then she heard him shake the reins, and the wagon groan, and the slow grind of wheels pulling away down the road. She kept digging. She kept digging long after the sound of the wheels had faded, long after the dust had settled back down onto the road. And only then, when she was certain he was truly gone, did she finally stop. She stood very still in the bottom of the trench, both hands wrapped around the handle of the tool, her eyes fixed on the raw clay wall in front of her, and she breathed, slow, deep, even, the way she had learned to breathe when the body wanted to do one thing and the will demanded another. She waited for the thing moving hot and sharp through her chest to settle, to sink down somewhere she could hold it without being burned. It took a while, but it settled. The old woman had heard every word of it. She said nothing for a long time. She only went on sharpening the blade across her knee, the long, even strokes never breaking their rhythm. And then, when the silence had done its work, she spoke, quietly, almost to herself. He is more afraid of being wrong than he is interested in being right. She held the blade up to the light, checking the edge. That is the most dangerous kind of man there is, child. Not the cruel one, the frightened one, who has dressed his fear up as certainty for so long that he has forgotten it was ever fear at all. She set the blade down. He will not stop at words. Ada looked up at her mother. No, she said, I do not think he will. A few days later, a different kind of visitor came. She did not arrive in a working wagon, raising dust. She came in a fine one, with a fine horse, and she stepped down carefully so as not to soil the hem of a dress far too good for an ordinary afternoon. She carried a loaf of bread, wrapped neat and warm in a clean white cloth. She was a handsome woman, well past her middle years but carrying them gracefully, with a face that could arrange itself into an expression of warm and tender concern as easily as other women arrange flowers in a vase. Her name was Vivian Ainsley. She came to the edge of the trench, and she looked down into it, and she made a small, soft sound of gentle distress, as though the sight of it pained her personally. Oh, she breathed, you poor, poor dear. Grief does such strange things to us. It takes us to such strange places. She held out the bread, as one might offer something to a creature one was not entirely sure of. You should come to the gathering, she said, on the days the women sew together. There are good people there, warm people, people who would look after you and bring you back to yourself. A pause, perfectly placed. And there are good men in this town, you know, settled men. Men who would be glad to take on a situation like yours. You are far too young, dear, to bury yourself alive in a hole in the ground. Ada set down her tool. She climbed out of the trench, slow and deliberate, brushing the clay from her hands onto her trousers. She took the offered bread. She said, "Thank you." And she carried it over and set it down gently on the log beside the old woman. Then she came back, and she stood square in front of Vivian Ainsley, and she looked her full in the eye. "I want to ask you something directly, Mrs. Ainsley," she said. Her voice was perfectly level, not cold, not warm, just clear, as still water is clear. Are you here because you are worried for me, or because it troubles you to drive past this cabin and see what I am doing, and not understand it?" Vivian Ainsley blinked. It was a small thing, the smallest flicker, smoothed away almost before it appeared. But Ada had spent a summer learning to read the small movements of the earth before it gave way. And she had learned to read faces the same way. She had seen it. "I am here because I care for you," the woman said, and her voice had gone just slightly thin. "Of course I am." "Then you will be glad to know that I am well," Ada said. "Better than I have been in a long while. Thank you for the bread." And she held the silence. And she waited. Vivian Ainsley left with her back very straight and her chin held high. She did not look back. That night, the old woman watched her daughter eat the bread by the fire. "You made an enemy today," Ruth said, but there was no scolding in it. If anything, there was the faint, dry warmth of approval. "I told her the truth," Ada said, around a mouthful of bread that was, she had to admit, very good bread. "Yes." The old woman nodded slowly into the flames. "With a woman like that, those are usually the same thing." The fire popped and shifted. "She does not forgive being seen," Ruth went on. "Not the way you saw her tonight. She will smile at you on the road. She will be all warmth and concern where the light can reach her." A pause. "And she will whisper at every table you are not sitting at. The bread is a kindness, but it is also a leash, and you were meant to take hold of the other end of it. You did not. She will not forget that." Ada looked into the fire for a long moment. "Let her whisper," she said at last. And in the dark, the old woman smiled. Just a little. The pressure did not stay quiet for long. It came next, not as a word, and not as a loaf of bread, but as a single folded piece of paper. And it was carried to the cabin door by the sheriff himself. His name was Len Cole, a man who had kept the peace in that town for 20 years. He took off his hat when she opened the door. He held the folded paper in both his hands, the way a man holds something he wishes he did not have to hold. And he did not quite manage to meet her eyes. It was an official notice, signed by the authority of the town. It spoke of concern for public safety. The open pit, it said, posed a hazard to anyone who might pass by it in the dark. She was therefore directed to fill it in within a set number of days, or else pay a fine. The sheriff stood on her porch and looked at a fixed point somewhere past her left shoulder. "I know this is not a good time," he said. "Who asked for this, Sheriff?" Ada said. "It came through the town office. I am asking who asked for it." A pause. There were concerns raised by several people. "Calvin Brandt raised them," Ada said, flat and certain. "And the man who put his name to this signed it because Brandt asked him to. And his wife is still sore with me from the visit she paid last week." She glanced down at the paper in his hands. "Tell me, Sheriff, does this notice say one single word about a fence?" Len Cole, against what was clearly his better judgment, looked down and read it again, carefully. "No," he admitted. "Then I will have a fence up around it by the end of the week, a good one, tall and sound." She lifted her chin. "And is there anything written in that paper that stops me from going on digging a properly fenced hole?" Another pause, longer this time. long enough that she could see the man working through it and finding no way around it. "No," he said, "there is not." "Then I thank you for delivering it." She held the door open for him. The sheriff put his hat back on his head. He turned to go. And then he stopped, halfway across the porch, one hand resting on the rail, his broad back to her. "You are playing a dangerous game, Mrs. Hale." "I am digging a hole to get my family through the winter," she said. "It is not a game. It has never been a game." He stood a moment longer. Then he walked away across the soft yard, his heavy boots leaving deep prints in the earth, and he climbed onto his horse, and he rode for the road. She watched him until he was gone, and when she turned back to the cabin, the old woman was standing in the doorway. She had heard all of it. She had heard Calvin Brandt weeks before. She had heard Vivian Ainsley. And now she had heard this. She had sat on her log all summer and sharpened the blades and said the right thing at the right moment and nothing more. But now she said something she had been carrying for a very, very long time. Something she had decided that very morning, watching her daughter stand and face down a piece of paper built for the single purpose of stopping her, was finally ready to be set down. "I told you," Ruth said slowly, "that I had my suspicions about who it was that reported my father." Ada turned to face her fully. "I have never once said the name out loud," the old woman went on. Her voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of great effort. "All these years, I told myself that not knowing for certain was a kind of mercy, that a suspicion is not a fact, that a person can carry a suspicion and still walk through her days, but that to carry a fact, a hard and proven fact, would only make it heavier, would make it harder to keep going." She stopped. "But you should know it. You, of all people, standing where you are standing now." "Tell me," Ada said softly. "Harold Brandt," the old woman said. The name fell into the space between them like a coal dropped onto dry wood. "Calvin's father. He wanted the timber contract that year more than he had ever wanted anything. And my father—" Ruth's voice did not break, but it went very quiet. "My father was the only thing standing between him and the having of it." Ada said nothing for a long moment. She turned and she looked out toward the dark line of trees to the north, the place where the pines began, and a mile beyond them, unseen in the gathering dusk, the wide and prosperous land that belonged to the Brandt family. 3 generations, one act of cowardice, dressed up in the fine clothes of concern for the public good. A good man driven from his home, dead alone in a far-off city. A daughter left to carry the unspoken weight of it for the whole length of her life. And now a granddaughter, standing in a hole in the ground, trying with her own 2 ruined hands to finish what he had begun, and never been allowed to keep. Ada looked down at her hands. She did not weep. She did not rage. She had passed beyond both of those, somewhere down in the bottom of that trench. She simply went, in the last of the light, to fetch the wire for the fence. It was around this time that the girl came closer. For weeks, Ada had been aware of her, a small, quiet presence at the edge of things. Always in the late part of the afternoon, when the light went long and gold through the pines. Always with that same small notebook held against her chest, like something precious that might be taken away. She stayed at the fence line, or just beyond it. And she watched. But she did not watch the way the others watched. Ordinary curiosity looks for the interesting parts and grows bored the moment nothing interesting is happening. What this girl did was something else entirely. Something patient, methodical. She did not watch the action. She watched the order of things, the sequence, the reason one thing was done before another. She watched the way a person watches who is trying to understand exactly how a thing is built. One afternoon, Ada climbed out of the trench and found her standing closer than she had ever come before, perhaps 20 feet from the edge, studying the line of timber posts that now stood along the near wall. "Ask what you came to ask," Ada said. The girl did not startle. She did not run. She looked up from her notebook with the calm composure of someone who had rehearsed this exact conversation 100 times in her own head, and had only been waiting for the chance to use it. "How do you know where to put the air shafts?" she asked. "You angle them away from the wind that comes most often," Ada said. "In a valley shaped like this one, that means facing them one way, and never the other. The openings that face into the worst of the weather get choked with drifting snow before the season is half over. The ones that face away from it stay open, stay breathing." She paused and looked at the notebook clutched against the girl's chest. "You have been drawing all of this, haven't you?" It was not really a question. The girl's pencil had been moving every single time Ada had glanced up at the fence all summer long. The girl hesitated, and then, slowly, she turned the notebook around and held it up. The drawing stopped Ada where she stood. It was good. Far better than it had any earthly right to be from a child who had never once set foot inside the trench. The proportions were nearly true. The shelves were marked in careful dotted lines along the walls. The air shafts were drawn in, but they were angled the wrong way, pointing straight into the path of the worst weather. Ada studied the page for a long moment. The girl watched her face, waiting for the verdict, braced for it. Then Ada handed the notebook back. "Find the mistake," she said. The girl's brow furrowed. She looked down at her own drawing, and then she looked up, past Ada, at the line of timber posts standing in the trench. All of them turned the same way. All of them facing away from the dark northern sky where the storms were born. And something moved behind the girl's eyes. The small, bright, almost audible click of a piece falling into place. "My father says you are going to fail," she said. She said it without any cruelty in it at all. She said it the way a person repeats a thing they have heard so many times from so high an authority that they have only just now begun, very quietly, to wonder whether it might not be true. "I know what your father says," Ada answered, "and he is not a stupid man. He knows more about the cutting and the selling of wood than any man in this valley." She bent and picked up a piece of well-seasoned timber and turned it slowly in her hard brown hands. "That is one kind of knowledge, a real kind, but it is not the only kind, and it is not this one." The girl wrote something quickly in her notebook. Ada could not see what. "My father also says," the girl went on, not looking up from the page, "that women have no need to learn how to read a building plan, that it is not for us." She lifted her eyes. "What do you think?" Ada looked at her for a long, long moment. "What do you think?" she said. The girl was quiet. Then she turned to a fresh, clean page in her notebook. and she began, carefully, to draw the air shafts all over again, this time angled the right way, away from the weather, toward the breathing dark. "I think," she said, her eyes never leaving the page, "that I am going to teach myself to read them anyway." And Ada looked at this girl, 14 years old, with her pencil and her notebook and her careful, stubborn, quiet defiance. A girl told all her life what she was not meant to understand, sitting at a fence in the gold evening light, understanding it anyway. And Ada felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not quite hope, something steadier than hope, something with deeper roots, the plain recognition that certain things continue, whether or not the people carrying them are ever thanked, whether or not anyone is even watching at all. She would learn the girl's name soon enough. Clara Brandt, the lumberman's own daughter. The work was hard with one person. It became something else entirely the day a man arrived who did not ask permission. Ada was deep in the main shaft when she heard the wagon stop on the road above. By then, she could name her visitors by sound, long before she ever saw their faces. The slow, deliberate halt of someone who had already made a decision before they arrived. The creak of a man climbing all the way down, rather than leaning over from his seat to deliver his opinion. Then boots on the dry ground. Heavy, unhurried, coming closer. She kept digging. A few minutes later, a figure appeared at the edge of the trench above her, blocking a piece of the sky. He had a length of seasoned board tucked under one arm, and a carpenter's square held in the other hand. His name was Gideon Ward, the town's blacksmith, a man so spare with his words that a whole season could pass between his sentences. He looked down into the hole with no expression at all on his weathered face, the way a man looks at a problem he has already worked out completely, somewhere behind his own eyes. "The side walls are going to fail," he said. Ada looked up at him. "Good afternoon to you too, Gideon." "It is not a criticism," he said evenly. "It is an observation." He held up the carpenter's square as though it proved his point. "The clay this deep holds a great deal of water. When the summer dries it out, it will shrink sideways. The walls will crack at the corners, and then they will lean, and then they will push inward." He pointed a thick finger at the near wall. "You need posts, every few feet, with good braces set between them, before you cut one more inch deeper than you already have." Ada set down her pickaxe. She looked at the walls around her, slowly, and she saw at once, with a cold drop in her stomach, that he was exactly right. She had seen the first hairline cracks beginning to spider out from the corners. She had seen them days ago, and she had told herself they were nothing. "You have been watching a while," she said. "Some weeks now." She climbed up out of the trench. She came and stood in front of him, and she let the silence sit there between them for a moment, because it had earned the right to sit there. "Some weeks," she said again, "while I went on doing it wrong. While I went on deciding," he answered, "whether or not I remembered it right." He bent and set the board down carefully on the ground. "I saw a passage like this built once, a long time ago, when I was a boy. A neighbor put one in, after 2 bad winters nearly finished his family. It worked. It worked the way your mother says it works." He paused. "I was not sure my memory of it was good enough to trust you with. A man can do real harm. handing over half-remembered things as though they were whole. "And now you are sure," Ada said. "Now I have watched you long enough to know 2 things." He picked the square back up. "The design is sound, and the building of it needs help." He looked at her steadily. "I am also here," he added more quietly, "because I have not slept well in some time. Watching a thing be done right, by a person doing it all alone, it sits on a man. After a while." Ada looked at him for a long moment. She had known Gideon Ward as a neighbor for years, and she could count the true conversations they had shared on the fingers of a single hand. The fact that he had just said more to her in 2 minutes than she had heard from him in all those years before told her everything she needed to know about the weight he had been carrying up to her gate. She stepped aside and made room for him at the edge of the trench. "The posts need to be a good 4 inches through," she said, "and I want to start setting them at the very deepest point and work our way back toward the entrance." "That is the right order," he said, and he stepped past her, and he knelt at the edge of the trench, and he began, without another word, to measure. From her place on the log, the old woman watched all of it. She did not say a thing. When her daughter glanced over at her, Ruth gave a single, small nod. A nod that carried a great many things in it at once, none of which needed to be spoken aloud. The work changed with 2 sets of hands at it, not because it became easy. It never once became easy, but it found a rhythm. The particular rhythm that 2 people can fall into together, that a single person working alone in the dark can never hold for very long. Gideon cut and shaped and set the heavy posts. Ada drove the passage deeper, and the old woman sharpened the blades and called out the measurements, and now and again corrected the lean of a post with the quiet, absolute authority of someone reading aloud from a page that only she could see. They did not talk much, the 3 of them. That was fine. Ada had come, over that long summer, to distrust people who talked too much while their hands were busy. So often, words were just a way of setting down the weight of the thing you were holding, before you had earned the right to set it down. And the trench became a passage, and the passage, slowly, began to take on the shape of something that might actually stand, something that might actually hold. There were good days in that stretch of summer, days that Ada would carry with her long afterward and turn over in the quiet and be surprised by the warmth still in them. The day the first full row of posts stood finished, straight and true and solid, and she ran her bare hand down the length of one and felt, for the very first time, that perhaps the earth could be persuaded after all. The day Clara called out a correction from the fence line, sharp and certain, before Gideon could set a brace wrong, and the blacksmith stopped and turned and looked at the girl for a long moment, and then went and did it her way. And the evenings, when the day's work was finally done, and the 3 of them, and sometimes at the fence, a watching forth, sat in the last gold light, and the old woman told her small stories. Not the heavy ones, not the buried ones, not yet. Stories of winters long, long past. The winter the creek froze so deep that a horse walked clear across it without cracking the ice. The winter her own mother read the same 3 books aloud, over and over, all the season through, because there was nothing else in the whole house to read. Small stories, the kind that gather quietly, the way snow gathers, until one day you look up, and they have become a life. And for a little while, in the warmth of those evenings, it was almost possible to forget what was coming, to forget the cold, patient promise that waited for them all on the far side of the turning year. Almost. But Calvin Brandt was not a man who forgot, and he was not a man who could let a thing he had publicly declared impossible go on quietly, day after day, proving him wrong in front of the whole valley. The whispers from the road began to change. Ada could feel it, even from inside her own fence. The talk was no longer only the poor mad widow. Now there was a new edge underneath it, something harder, something that sounded almost like resentment, because something was being built out at the edge of town, something solid and real and stubborn, something that did not seem to care in the least what the great Calvin Brandt had said about it. And men like Calvin Brandt do not, in the end, fear failure. They fear something worse than failure. They fear being made to look the fool. The old woman felt it before her daughter did. One still afternoon, near the end of the summer, she set down the blade she had been sharpening, and she went very quiet, and she looked north, toward the trees, toward the unseen land beyond them. "It is coming," Ruth said softly. "What is?" The old woman did not answer right away. She looked at her daughter, standing there in the half-finished passage, lean now and sun-browned, and stronger by far than the grieving girl who had picked up the first spade in the spring. And there was something almost like sorrow in the old, clear eyes. "The part," she said at last, "where they stop laughing." A long pause. "And start in earnest to try and take it from you." That night, after Gideon had gone home and her mother slept, Ada took a single lantern and went down into the passage alone. She stood at the entrance and looked down its length. The posts marched away into the dark, straight and certain, holding back the patient weight of all that earth. The shelves were beginning to take their shape along the walls, waiting to be filled. And rising up around her in the dark was that smell she had come to love more than she could say. Cool earth, fresh-cut timber, the clean, resinous breath of the work. It was real now. It was no longer a wild idea, no longer a grieving woman's folly, no longer a hole that the whole town could lean over their fences and laugh at. It was a thing that existed, a thing with weight and form and purpose, a thing that her own two hands had pulled up out of the unwilling ground. And somewhere out there, beyond the trees, a powerful and frightened man had decided that it should not exist at all. Ada laid her hand flat against the nearest post. She felt the solid, honest grain of it under her palm, the proof of every blistered, aching, endless day. She thought of the grandfather she had never met, the man who had stood on this very ground, believing in a thing that no one else could see. The man who had built this once before and been destroyed for the building of it. She thought of her mother, sitting out there on her log all summer long, carrying his unspoken name through the whole length of a life. And she thought of the girl at the fence, bent over her notebook in the failing light, teaching herself, in secret, to read the plans her own father swore she had no business reading. 3 generations standing behind her, and one, perhaps, standing just ahead. "I am not going to stop," Ada said quietly, into the dark, to the posts, to the patient earth. to whatever part of the man who had built this first might still somehow be listening. And in the silence of the passage, something answered. Not a voice, not a sound she could have named to another living soul. A long, low groan, deep in the earth, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. The sound of a great weight somewhere out beyond the lantern light, beginning, very slowly, to shift. She lifted the lantern higher, and there, along the far wall, in the place where the bracing had not yet reached, the clay had begun, almost gently, to bulge inward, to lean, to bow out from the dark behind it, like a held breath, waiting to be let go. The lantern flickered. Ada Hale stood very still in the belly of the earth, and she looked at that swelling wall, and somewhere far above her, out past the trees, the first true cold breath of the turning year moved down through the pines, and was gone. She did not know yet that the wall would come down with her beneath it. She did not know about the box, or the name hidden inside it, or the unfinished words that would one day stop her breath. She knew only this, that the easy part was over now, and that everything that truly mattered was still ahead of her, waiting in the dark. The wall came down 3 days later. There was no great warning. That is the cruelty of the earth. It does not shout before it strikes. It only sighs. Ada was working at the far end of the passage, the deepest part, the place that would one day hold the heaviest of the stored wood. Gideon was 30 feet behind her, fitting a brace into place. The steady knock of his mallet, the only sound. The work had been going well. Too well, perhaps. She had begun to feel that dangerous, easy confidence that comes from understanding a problem just well enough to stop fearing it. That confidence was a mistake. The sound came first. That same low groan she had heard alone in the lantern light. Felt in the chest before it was ever heard with the ears. She looked up at the left wall, and she saw it move. Not much. An inch, maybe 2, the face of the clay bowing slowly inward, like a cheek pressed from behind. She had just enough time for one clear, strange thought. This is the pocket of water Gideon warned of, the one I never found. Then the wall let go. It was not the kind of collapse that buries a person whole. The bracing above held. The ceiling held. What failed was a single broad section of the left wall, and it came in fast, and it came in heavy. A surge of wet clay and stone and torn roots. It knocked her sideways and buried her legs to the knee before she could so much as lift a hand. The weight of it was enormous. Not sharp, the way a blow is sharp. Comprehensive. Total. Like being held down by something vast and patient that had decided simply not to let go. She heard Gideon shout from far back in the dark. She heard him moving, fast, scrambling over fallen earth toward her. And then, underneath all of it, underneath the ringing in her ears and the crushing weight on her legs, and the sudden thick smell of wet earth everywhere at once, she became aware of something she had not expected. She was looking up at the sky. The collapse had opened a narrow gap at the top of the wall, and through it, far above her, she could see a single thin strip of the late afternoon. Blue, absolute, utterly, perfectly indifferent to whatever was happening below it, perhaps 8 inches wide, a ribbon of sky, and looking up at it, pinned in the dark with the earth pressing cold against both legs. She thought of Caleb. She had not let herself do this. Not directly, not once in all the long months. She had held the thought of him at a careful distance, the way you carry a weight without ever quite looking at it, aware of it, never examining it. But now, in the dark, with that strip of impossible blue above her, she could not hold the distance any longer. He had been on a high trail in the cold of that last winter, a trail he knew well, a trail everyone knew, and the snow above it had come down fast. She had been told it was very quick. She had accepted that, the way you accept the things people tell you to help you bear what cannot be borne. And now, looking up at that ribbon of sky, she thought, did he see this? In the last of it, was there light above him, or only the coming dark? The thought did not break her. She had been certain that it would. For all these months, she had built her whole strange life around not letting herself look at it, because she had believed, with her whole heart, that to look at it directly would be the end of her. She had been wrong. It moved through her like cold water moving through cupped hands. It hurt. It hurt the clean, true way that real things hurt. But when it had passed, it left something behind, not comfort, something harder and quieter and more honest than comfort. A kind of acknowledgement. He had been here, and then he had not. And the sky had gone right on being blue, as though nothing in the world had changed. And she was here, down in a hole in the cold ground, trying with everything she had to make certain that she could go on being here, and that no one else she loved would be taken by a winter they were not ready for. Then Gideon reached her. He took in the whole of it in a single glance, and he did not pull. A lesser man would have grabbed her arms and hauled, and the wet clay would have only gripped her tighter. Instead, he dropped to his knees and began to dig with his bare hands, working around the edges of the buried section, easing the pressure before he ever tried to free her. And from above, from the open mouth of the trench, through that ribbon of failing sky, came the old woman's voice, steady, not raised, not frightened, carrying down into the dark like something solid you could hold on to. Do not pull her straight up, Ruth called down. The clay will only close tighter around her. Work from the sides first. Free the right leg. Leave the left until the right is clear. Gideon worked from the sides. It took the better part of an hour. Ada helped where she could, digging with her own raw hands in the space he opened, feeling for the give in the soil that meant she could move without bringing more of it down. Her right leg came free first, then the left, slowly, with a thick, sucking sound, as the earth at last let go of what it had taken. She came up out of that hole, leaning the whole of her weight on the blacksmith's arm. Her legs were bruised from the knee to the shin, dark and deep. Her hands were raw and bleeding. She sat down hard on the open ground in the last of the daylight, and she breathed. And after a moment, she noticed something. There was no one else there. Gideon had come. The old woman was above her. But the girl who came 3 times in every week, without fail, the girl who had been at that fence for the whole of the long summer, was nowhere to be seen. Clara, Ada said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. Was she here? Gideon was quiet for half a second too long. She came to get me, he said. Ada turned and looked at him. She was at the fence when the wall went, he said. She did not freeze. She did not run home and hide it. She turned, and she ran the whole way to my forge, fast as her legs would carry her. That is how I knew to come. He paused. If she had not, I do not know that I would have reached you in time. Ada absorbed this slowly. Clara Brandt, the daughter of the very man who wanted all of this to fail. The girl had been watching when the earth came down, and in that single frozen instant, she had made a choice, and the choice had cost her something, because to run to Gideon Ward meant that her father would, sooner or later, learn that she had been here, that she had been coming all summer. There would be a reckoning for that in the Brandt house. A hard one. Ada could imagine it clearly enough. The girl had made the choice anyway. That night, the old woman wrapped her daughter's legs in strips of cloth soaked in cold water from the well. The bruising was deep, the color of a plum left too long on the branch. They are right, Ada said. She said it quietly, to the floor, not to her mother. Brandt, the sheriff, everyone who said this was too much for two people. The earth nearly took me today. It nearly finished it. The old woman tied off the last strip of cloth, and she sat back, and she looked at her daughter with the expression of someone who has heard these exact words before. Not from this woman, but from the long line of all the people who arrive, at last at the very bottom of the hardest part, and mistake the bottom for the end. The earth tested you, Ruth said. It asked whether you were worthy of its secrets. She folded the loose end of the cloth, neat and careful. Tomorrow you will go back, and before you cut 1 inch deeper, you will build the bracing in that broken section, not because you failed today, but because now you know exactly where it is weak. Ada said nothing. My father brought a wall down on himself once, the old woman went on. The year before he ever finished the passage, he told me, after, that he understood the ground better than any man who had never made that mistake. She looked into the dark. The ground does not give itself to the careful child. It gives itself to the ones who have been buried, and dug themselves out, and gone back down anyway. Ada looked at her mother, at the 70 years written in her face, at that particular stillness in her that did not come from peace, but from having walked through a great many terrible things, and come out the far side of them whole. She said nothing more that night, but she was standing at the trench before the sun came up. Calvin Brandt came back not many days after that, but this time he did not come to lean from his wagon and offer his opinions. This time he came down. This time he came close. He found her at the surface, mixing a batch of clay packing for the new bracing. He stood over her, and the morning sun was behind him, so that he was only a great dark shape against the light. You nearly died in that hole, he said. Ada did not look up from her work. I have heard that, she said. My daughter was here when it happened. His voice was very tight now, very controlled, the voice of a man holding something down hard. She has been coming here all summer, behind my back. She has been learning, Ada said. There is a difference. That was when he changed. She had seen the frightened man under the certain one weeks ago, in the quiet way he had spoken of Caleb. Now she saw what that frightened man did when he was truly cornered. when the thing he had declared impossible had not only refused to die, but had reached out somehow and taken his own child. He did not raise his voice. That was the worst of it. "I came to tell you," he said very evenly, "that you are going to stop today, because if you do not, I am going to take everything that man of yours left you in debt for, and I am going to make certain that no one in this valley sells you a single nail, or a single board, or a single sack of meal for as long as you live in it." He paused. "And I am going to start," he said, "with the blacksmith." The threat did not come to Gideon Ward in person. It came folded, like the sheriff's notice had come. It came to his forge by the hand of one of Brant's own millmen, who handed it over without ever once meeting the blacksmith's eyes, and then left as fast as his feet would carry him. The paper held a list of names, 5 of them, and every single one was a man Gideon Ward had shod horses for, and mended tools for, and bent good iron for, season after season, for the better part of his working life. Farmers, ranchers, the men who kept his forge fire lit, and beneath the list, in a hard and heavy hand, a single line: "These men will be making other arrangements if the present situation continues." No threat that could be named out loud, no raised voice, just a list and a sentence, and the cold, clear understanding of exactly what both of them meant together. Gideon came to the cabin the following afternoon. He did not come to the door. He stood at the edge of the yard, at the line where the worked ground gave way to the wilder grass, and he waited there, hat in his hands, until Ada came up out of the passage and saw his face, and she knew before he said a single word. "I cannot keep coming," he said. Ada pulled the work gloves slowly from her ruined hands. She held them, one in each fist. "I know what he sent you," she said. "Ada, I know what was written on it, and I know whose names were on the list, and I understand exactly what it means for you if you stay." She looked at him steadily. There was no anger in her face, none at all. "I am not going to argue with you, Gideon. I am only going to say that I am sorry for all of it, for what staying with me has cost you." "I am the one who is sorry," he said, and he stood there a moment longer, the way a man stands when he has braced himself for an argument, and the absence of the argument has left him with nothing to push against. Then he nodded, once, and he turned and he walked back down the road. Ada watched him go, and the strange thing was, she did not feel the fury she might have expected. What she felt instead was something older, something she had come to know very well, down in that hole, in the long months since the winter took Caleb, the particular weight of standing in a place where you are entirely alone, where the last good person who stood beside you has just made the only reasonable choice there was to make, and where the work ahead of you is exactly, precisely the same as it was the moment before, except that now it is only yours. She went back down into the passage. 3 mornings later, she came out at first light to fetch water, and there, on the ground, just inside the mouth of the trench, was a bundle, a new pickaxe head, 2 fresh shovel blades, a broad-faced chisel of the kind used for cutting clean air shafts, iron of a quality that no one else in the whole valley could produce, the kind of iron that came from one forge, and one pair of hands only. No note, no name, no word at all. Ada crouched down beside the tools in the gray morning light. For a long while, she did not move. Then she picked up the new pickaxe head, and she carried it inside, and she set about fitting it to the handle. She did not tell her mother where it had come from. The old woman did not ask. It was while clearing a corner of the old root cellar, making room for the finished work to come, that she found the box. It was small, perhaps the length of a man's forearm, made of pine that had darkened over a great span of years to the deep gold of old honey. It was bound with a strip of leather that had dried and cracked into pieces. She nearly moved it without ever opening it. It was light. She assumed it held nothing but old rags or some rusted scrap of hardware long forgotten. What it held was a notebook. The leather cover was soft and worn with age, and the pages inside were dense with a small, careful, deliberate hand. The hand of a man who had taught himself his letters late in life, and treated each one of them with the patient respect of someone who understood deeply that letters cost something to learn. The ink had faded to brown, but every word of it was still clear. She carried it outside. She did not run. She walked slowly to where the old woman sat, and she held it out. Without a single word, Ruth took it. She looked at the cover. She looked at the first line of writing on the first page, and her hands, the hands that had stayed perfectly steady all through the collapse, steady through every visit, steady through a lifetime of holding hard things, were not steady now. "This is my father's hand," she said. They read it together in the long gold evening, with the lantern between them. Most of it was the plain record of the work, measurements, lists of materials, the order of the decisions a careful man had made, building this same passage in a time long before either of them had drawn breath. But threaded all through the practical lines was something else, a voice, a man who thought hard about what he was doing and why. A man who understood that the passage was never only about the wood. There were lines about the warmth his family had known, the winter the neighbors burned their furniture, lines about what it meant to have made ready. When readiness had looked, to everyone around him, like foolishness. And then, near the middle of the book, in an entry that came after that terrible winter, a single name. Not a guess, not a suspicion. A plain record of a thing overheard. A conversation between two men at the trading post who did not know that Elias Crane stood just behind the stacked goods, close enough to hear every word. The name he wrote was Harold Brandt. A record of the report the man intended to make, and of the timber contract that would fall open the moment the Crane nuisance was dealt with. Ada read it twice. Then she looked up at her mother. The old woman was very still. She was looking down at the page with the face of someone who has carried a terrible weight for the whole length of a life, and has only just now been told, beyond all doubt, that the weight was exactly as heavy as it had always felt. "You knew," Ada said softly. It was not an accusation. It was a recognition. "I suspected," the old woman said. "There is a difference. I told myself all these years that the difference mattered." She turned the page. The entry went on, and what Elias Crane had written, after setting down the name of the man who would destroy him, stopped Ada's breath. He had not written hatred. He had written that a man who would do such a thing was a man ruled Entirely. By fear. Fear of being outworked by someone who had less and did more with it. Fear, in the end, of a world that was larger and more capable than his own small vision of it could bear. And I pity him, the dead man had written, more than I blame him. A man who must destroy what he cannot match is a man who will never, in all his days, know what he might have built instead. And there the entry ended. It was the last page that undid her. It came near the very end of the book. The hand was less careful now, looser, as though written in cold or in great fatigue, or in the slow diminishment that comes to a man near the end of his strength. He had been writing a letter. To whom, it never said. Perhaps to the daughter he had left behind. Perhaps to no one at all. Perhaps only to the act of the writing itself, the last thread holding him to the world. The sentence stopped at the third word of the sixth line, and the paper, all around those final words, was warped, dried into the shape of something that had once been wet, and then left to sit, untouched, for a very long time. The book had been closed before the ink was dry. Ada looked at that unfinished line for a long, long time. Then she closed the notebook, gently, carefully, the way you close a thing that belongs to someone else. She handed it back to her mother. The old woman held it in both her hands. She did not speak for a while, and when she did, her voice was very quiet, but it was not broken. It had passed all the way through grief, somewhere on the far side of all these years, and come out into something steadier. He would have wanted the passage finished, Ruth said. That is the only answer there is to what is written in those pages. Not anger, not a confrontation in the road. She looked at her daughter. He would have wanted the passage finished, and the wood dry, and the fire burning warm through the very worst winter anyone could remember. She closed the book. That is how you answer a man like Harold Brandt, and that is how you answer his son. Ada nodded. She stood. She walked to where the new pickaxe leaned against the wall, the one that had arrived in the gray dawn, with no name and no note. Then we have work to do, she said. The cold came early that year. It came the way the old woman had said it would, all those months ago, reading the signs in the caterpillars and the squirrels and the falling air. The yellow leaves came down overnight, and the mornings carried a hard edge that was no longer a warning. It was a promise being kept. Ada worked from the first gray light to the last. Her body, by now, was a different instrument than the one that had picked up the first spade in the spring. The movements were spare, exact, not one stroke wasted. She had learned over the long course of the work that endurance is not made of force. It is made of the patient stripping away of everything that is not necessary. The passage was finished in the first hard week of the cold, and then came the wood. Load after load, hauled from the forest behind the cabin, stacked onto the shelves in the careful pattern the old woman directed from her chair near the entrance, each piece set apart from the next, each row laid to let the cool, dry air move freely between them, drawing the last of the green from the heart of the timber. It took 11 days to fill it, and on the last of them, when the final load was set in place, Ada stood at the deepest end of the passage and looked back toward the entrance, her lantern throwing warm light down the length of all that stored and waiting heat. She breathed in the smell of it, fresh-cut wood and dry earth, the finest smell she thought, that she had ever known. And she became aware, in that moment, of a presence she had not let herself name. Near the entrance, along the lower shelf, the wood was stacked in a pattern just slightly different from her own. The spacing a little tighter, the pieces turned at an angle she had never used, more clever than her own arrangement, more efficient. She had noticed it 2 days before, and she had said nothing. And there, on the ground just inside the entrance, half hidden where the last load had been carried in, she found a small ribbon, blue. The exact blue of a plain dress she had watched at her fence line 3 times a week for the whole of a long summer. Ada picked it up. She turned it over once in her hard fingers, and she put it carefully into her pocket. Then she went to the entrance, where her mother stood waiting in the gathering cold. The old woman stepped inside the finished passage. She placed her right hand flat against the timber that lined the wall, and she held it there a moment, and then she knocked 3 times, soft. "My father did this," Ruth said. "At every finished thing he ever built, he said the work deserved to know, that it was finished." Ada laid her own hand against the wall beside her mother's, and she knocked 3 times. They sealed the entrance that evening, and when they were done, the passage was invisible from above. The earth showed not one sign of the long summer's work, or of all that warmth waiting in the dark beneath it. The snow could come now, and the wind, and the deep, patient cold that the falling leaves, and the early squirrels, and the old woman's certain reading had all been promising since the spring. Whatever was coming for them, they were ready for it. And then, between one nightfall and the next, the storm arrived. It did not come the way the cold usually comes, with days of warning gathering in the sky. It came in a single night, and by the time the cabin woke to a gray and howling morning, the whole world had not been changed. It had been replaced. The road was gone. The fences were only suggestions beneath the drifts. The space between the buildings of the town, far below, had become one single unbroken sweep of white that shifted and moved with the wind until it seemed almost to be alive. Ada built the first fire of the storm before the sun rose. She went down through the root cellar. She opened the small reinforced door in the earthen wall, and she stepped into the passage, into that cool, dry air she had spent half a year creating, carrying its faint, clean breath of seasoned wood. She took 2 armloads from the lower shelf and carried them up. The wood caught in under a minute. It burned clean, and even, with a heat that was immediate and full. Not the cautious, sputtering warmth of green wood fighting its own wet heart. Real heat. The kind that pushes the cold back out of a room and holds it at the door. She stood before the fire with her hands held out to it, and outside, the storm threw itself against the cabin walls with a sound like one long roll of thunder that never ended. And inside, it was warm. The first days of the storm were almost peaceful. Strange as that was, there is a particular peace that comes from being inside a well-made shelter while the world tears itself apart just beyond the walls. The wind was a constant voice in the timbers and around the window frame, but it could not get in. The fire needed feeding every few hours. Ada made the trip down through the cellar and into the passage with the easy regularity of a person doing a thing she understood completely. She took what was needed. She left the rest in the dark. The old woman sat by the fire and told her small stories, the warm ones, the gathering ones, And Ada listened and watched the flames and turned over in her mind the simple, enormous fact that she was warm. But on the far side of the storm, the town below was not. She saw it on the fourth day, through the small high window on the south wall, the slow silencing of the chimneys, one by one, the thin struggling threads of smoke that had risen from the houses she could see, going gray, going faint, going out. The houses were still there. The people inside them were still there. But the fires were dying. The old woman came and stood beside her at the little window and looked at the same gray view. "How much is left?" Ruth asked. Ada had been keeping the count. "Enough," she said, "for 3 more weeks of this, if it does not get worse." "It will get worse," the old woman said quietly, "before it breaks." "I know." They stood together at the window a little longer, watching the chimneys go dark across the valley, one after another, and neither of them said the thing they were both already thinking, because the knock had not yet come. But it was coming, and when it did, every choice the long summer had been building toward, every cruelty and every kindness and every buried name, would arrive at last at her door, out of the white and howling dark. The knock came on the 7th night. Ada was not asleep. She had not slept well since the chimneys began to go dark. She lay awake in the warm room, listening to the storm, thinking of the houses she could see from the south window, and the ones she could not. She heard the knock through the wind, and she was at the door before it could come a second time. The sheriff stood on her porch. Len Cole was so caked in snow and ice that for a moment she did not know him. His coat had turned to one white shell, his brows, the days of beard along his jaw, all of it crusted hard with frost, and behind him, out in the blowing dark, there were shapes. She counted them. 7, 8 more. Men from the town, standing in the snow, looking at her door. "Walter Pike," the sheriff said. His voice was raw with the cold. "We cannot get him warm. We have been burning his furniture for 3 days, and we cannot get him warm." He stopped. The words came hard. "There are children with fever. The doctor says they need heat, real heat." He looked at her, and his eyes had gone past pride, into the country that lies on the other side of it. "I do not know what you have in there, Mrs. Hale," he said, "but whatever it is, we need it." Ada looked at him, at the men behind him, dark against the white. She stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the wind," she said. The sheriff stepped inside, and another man followed, and then another, until her small cabin was full of cold men, breathing visible air, looking at the fire on her hearth with the faces of people who had not seen a real one in days. Len Cole looked at that fire. He looked at her. "How?" he said. Just the one word. "I made ready," she said. "The whole town is burning its own chairs, Mrs. Hale. Brant's mill has nothing left dry enough to catch, and you are sitting here with a fire like that." He shook his head slowly. "How?" She looked at him for a moment. This man who had come to her door months ago with a folded paper and a look that would not meet her eyes, and she did not feel triumph. She was far too tired for triumph. "I am going to show you something," she said, "and then every man in this room who can still lift his arms is going to work." She led them down through the root cellar, the lantern held high. Len Cole came directly behind her. She stopped at the small door in the earthen wall. He stared at it. He had been in this cellar once before, the spring before, and he was certain there had never been a door in that wall. She lifted the latch, and she pulled it open. The smell came first, that cool, dry, resinous breath of half a year of patient dark. The sheriff made a sound she had never heard from any man, brief, involuntary, and then he followed her in. The lantern light moved down the length of the passage, across the shelves. The wood was stacked from the floor to the ceiling on both sides, every piece set apart, row upon row of stored warmth, waiting in the dark. Len Cole reached out and touched the nearest piece with his gloved hand. Then he pulled the glove off and touched it again with his bare fingers, as though he could not trust the dryness of it until his own skin had confirmed it. He ran his hand along the timber of the wall. He looked at the framing, the joinery, the ceiling that held solid above his head, deep beneath the frozen earth. He looked at the size of it, the sheer, impossible reach of it, and she watched understanding arrive in him, not as information received, but as a thing he had believed being quietly torn down and built again. "My God," he said. It was not amazement. It was a man seeing, all at once, the true size of his own error. "Start with the pike house," Ada said, "and the children, then work outward. The coldest first." She looked at him. "The pastor has been to every house in town since this began. He knows the order better than you do. Listen to him." The sheriff nodded. Once, and he turned, and he began to organize the men. She went back up the stairs, and the old woman was sitting in her chair by the fire. She was sitting in a way that Ada had learned over the long months to pay close attention to. Not the upright, watchful posture of her ordinary evenings, a quieter one. One hand resting loose in her lap, her head bowed just slightly. "Mother." Ruth looked up. Her eyes were clear, but behind them was a tiredness so deep that it had stopped being something recent and become something that lived in her now. "Sit down," Ada said. "I am fine." "Sit down anyway." She sat beside her mother. She took the loose hand in both of her own. The fingers were cool. Not dangerously so, but cooler than they should have been, with the fire burning so strong. "I pushed too hard in the autumn," the old woman said. "All that standing, all that directing, out in the cold wind." She said it plainly, not as a complaint, as an honest accounting. "My chest has been tight for some weeks now. I did not tell you. There was nothing to be done about it in the middle of a storm." "There is something to be done about it," Ada said. "What?" "You stop pretending you are fine, and you let me sit here with you." The old woman looked at her daughter, and something in her face shifted, very slightly. The particular softening that comes over a person who has held a thing together for a very long time, when at last she is allowed to set it down. "I heard them go into the passage," she said. "They will take what is needed." Below them, through the floorboards, came the sound of it, the organized movement of men, the creak of the cellar door, opening and closing on its steady cycle, loads being gathered up and carried out into the storm. "My father would have done exactly this," Ruth said. "Opened it, given what he had, and he would not have made them ask him twice." "They only asked once," Ada said. She held her mother's hand, and she could feel, through it, the thin and careful pulse of a woman who had given everything she had to this, who had sat on a log through a whole hot summer, sharpening blades, who had translated a dead man's wisdom into living, breathing work, and who had arrived now, at this night, with far less left in her than she had ever let anyone see. She did not look away. She did not fill the quiet with comfort she could not promise. She only stayed, fully present in the chair beside her mother, and she let the night be exactly what it was. Calvin Brant came sometime after the middle of the night. She heard him before she saw him, the cadence of his voice in the cellar below, giving some direction to one of the men. A voice that was used always to being the largest in any room. She had not sent for him. She met him at the cellar door. He looked different than the man who had leaned from his wagon in the summer, not smaller. Calvin Brant could not look small, but the certainty was gone out of his bearing. In its place was something careful, the look of a man who had decided, for once in his life, to watch before he spoke. "Go ahead," Ada said. He went in first. She followed with the lantern. He walked the length of the passage slowly. He did not touch the wood, not at first. He looked at the building of it, the posts, the bracing, the fitted timber on the walls and ceiling, the clean joinery at every joint. He was a man who had spent his whole life judging the work of craftsmen, and she could see him doing it now, the judgment as automatic in him as his own breathing. He stopped at the far end. There, on the end wall, at about the height of a man's shoulder, was a single plank, older than the rest, darker. It had come from the materials stored in the back of the cellar, the remnants of some earlier work on this land. She had used it because it was the right size and the right thickness, and she had not looked at it closely until after it was set in place, carved into the face of it in the careful, deliberate letters of a man who had taught himself to write as a grown man. E. Crane. The sheriff raised his lantern, and the letters stood out clear in the light. Calvin Brant read them, and he stood before that plank for a very long time. Ada watched his face. She had thought, over the long months, about what this moment might look like if it ever came. She had imagined it as a confrontation, a verdict delivered. Standing here now, she found that it was none of those things. It was only the moment when a man reads something true and cannot ever again unread it. "Crane," he said. His voice had a quality in it she had never heard from him before. "That was the man my father reported to the county." It was not a question. He had known the story. He had grown up with it. Ada understood now. In the version that made Harold Brand a careful and responsible citizen, rather than a frightened and grasping one, he had simply never, in all his life, had to stand inside the physical proof of what his father had destroyed. "Elias Crane," Ada said, "my mother's father. He built the first passage on this land long before any of us. He was driven out of this valley, and he died alone in a far city not long after." She paused. "Your father wanted the timber contract. My family's grandfather was the only thing standing in his way." Calvin Brant did not move. The men working around them had slowed. They could feel something in the air of the passage, and now they stood with their arms full of wood and waited without quite knowing what it was they were waiting for. "I told you in the summer." Calvin said slowly. That your husband died from his own stubbornness. He stopped. That was a cruel thing to say to a grieving woman. I said it because I believed it would stop you. And I believed it would stop you. Because I needed you to stop. He looked at the carved plank. I have built my whole reputation on knowing wood. Everything I am, I built on the foundation my father gave me. His voice had gone very low. If you were right about this passage, then it did not only make me wrong, it made me uncertain of every single thing he ever taught me. And I could not bear that. So I decided you had to be wrong, and I set out to make it so. Ada said nothing. I understand, he said, that none of that excuses any of it. No, she agreed quietly. It does not. He turned then and faced her fully, and he asked the question that mattered, not the dramatic one, not the question of a man performing his sorrow for an audience, just the plain one. What can I do tonight? Take the second crew, Ada said. The Pike House is the farthest, and it needs the most. The sheriff will tell you the rest of the order, and listen to the pastor. Calvin Brandt nodded, and he turned to the men, and he began to divide them, calling names and assigning loads with the easy authority that was his natural register, pointed now, for the first time, in a direction that cost no one anything. The town did not die that night. The wood went out into the storm, load after load, on the backs of men who had mocked her for half a year. It went to the Pike House, where the pastor himself built up the fire with his own hands, his good coat gray with ash, because no one else had done it right, and the old man could not wait for someone to learn. It went to the houses where children burned with fever. It went out into the white and howling dark, and it pushed the cold back, one hearth at a time. And before the dawn, a woman came through the front door, not with a servant this time, alone, her fine coat heavy with snow on the shoulders, her hair come loose from whatever she had arranged it into hours before. Vivian Ainsley. She looked at the steady stream of men going down into the cellar and coming back up, and then she looked at Ada. Ada waited. My youngest, Vivian said, and her voice had none of the careful arrangement in it now, none of the smooth performance. He is small. He has not stopped shaking in 2 days. There will be wood at your house before morning, Ada said. The sheriff has the order. I know. The woman stopped. She looked down at her own hands, the way people do when they are searching them for words. I came to help carry. Ada looked at her. I am not entirely useless, Vivian Ainsley said, and there was something in it that was not the performance of humility, but the real and somewhat painful thing itself. Tell me what to do, and I will do it. Ada considered her for a moment. Go down, she said. Tell the men at the third shelf to take from the center, not the ends. The ends have to stay weighted, or the whole stack shifts. They have been taking from the wrong place for an hour, and Vivian Ainsley went down the stairs without one word more. The storm broke on the morning of the 9th day. It did not fade. It simply stopped. The wind that had howled without rest for over a week fell silent, all at once, and into that sudden silence, the snow it had been driving sideways began, for a little while, to fall straight down. And then that stopped too, and the sky that opened above the valley was a deep and impossible blue, the kind that seems to belong to a different world than the troubles below it. Ada stepped outside for the first time in 9 days. The world had been remade. The snow lay chest deep across the open ground and over the rooftops where it had drifted. The mountains to the north were smooth and white from their feet to their crowns, and from the chimneys of the town below, smoke rose, not from one, not from a few, from all of them. The whole battered, furniture-burning, half-frozen town was warming itself this morning, on wood that had spent half a year in the patient dark, being made ready for exactly this, and the proof of it was written in smoke against that clean and impossible blue. She stood a long time and looked at it, and then she went back inside to her mother. The old woman did not die that night, nor in the hard weeks that followed. The tightness in her chest eased as the worst of the cold went out of the air. She returned to her chair by the fire, and her knitting, and her stories. She was slower than she had been. She tired sooner, but she was there. She lived to see the spring come back to the valley. She lived to see the green return to the northern trees, and she lived to see the morning that Calvin Brandt came back to the cabin, not in winter, not in desperation, but in the soft light of an early spring, alone, with a paper of a different kind in his hand. He sat at Ada's table, and he set it down between them, a document carefully drawn. It named the passage. It set down, in plain and permanent words, who had first designed it, and who had built this one. It proposed that the work be recorded, and honored, and kept. "I want the name put back," Calvin said. "The name my father took out of this valley. I cannot give the man his life. I cannot give your mother back the years she carried it alone." He looked at the table. "But I can put the name back. It is the least that is owed." Ada read the paper slowly, and then she looked at her mother, who sat by the fire watching, her clear old eyes bright in the spring light. "I have been telling people I was wrong," Calvin went on, more quietly, "about the wood, about all of it. Because they listened to me when I said it would fail, and they deserve to hear me say, just as loud, that it did not. A man's word is the only thing he truly owns. I spent mine carelessly. I mean to earn it back." Ada signed the paper, and the old woman, from her chair, gave a single small nod. The same nod she had given 100 times across that long summer, from her log at the edge of the work. The nod that carried more than any words could. The old woman lived through 3 more turnings of the year. She passed, in the end, not in the cold, but in the spring. On a soft morning when the snowmelt ran loud in the creek, and the trees were putting out their first tentative leaves, she passed in her chair by the fire, and the fire was burning. Ada was with her. They had talked the night before about the man neither of them had truly known, about who Elias Crane had been in the years before the world took him. He had been, the old woman said, a man who never needed the people around him to tell him he was right. He understood that certain kinds of work speak for themselves, but only to those who are present when the results arrive. The important thing, she said, was never to be thanked. It was to have done the work. He would have been glad, the old woman said, that last night, her voice gone soft and far. Not proud, not avenged, just glad. That it held, that it kept someone warm. And then she slept. And in the morning, she was gone. Now here's the thing about a life like Ada Hale's. It does not end with the winter it survived. It does not end with the name carved back into the record, or the powerful man brought low and made humble, or the town that came at last to her door. Those were not the payment for what she had done. They were only the proof that she had done it. The real ending came quietly, in the springs that followed, in a thing so small that a stranger passing on the road would never have seen it at all. It came in a girl, kneeling in the turned spring earth near the old fence line, a short spade working steadily through the soil, a notebook open on the ground beside her, its pages dense with drawings and careful figures. Clara Brandt was older now. The stillness she had always carried sat deeper in her, worn in rather than worn over. Ada walked over to her, the way she had walked over 100 times. The girl did not stop working. The water runs different on this side of the fence than on yours, Clara said. I have to account for it. The shafts cannot go where they went in your design. Ada knelt down beside her, and she looked at the drawing. It was better than the one from that first summer, far better. The proportions were true. The marks for the load and the stress showed an understanding that went well past anything a person could simply watch and copy. Where did you learn to draw it like this? Ada asked. My father's books, Clara said. He has a whole shelf of them. He always let me read them. A pause. He used to think I read them for the interest. Now I think he knows I read them for the use. She looked up. He has not said anything about it, but he moved them down to a lower shelf, where I could reach. That is something, Ada said. It is something, the girl agreed, which was the more honest word. Ada looked at the patch of earth the girl had chosen, at the slope of it, and the soil she could see in the cut the spade had made. You need to start 3 feet further north, she said. The water you are accounting for runs closer to the surface than you think. Just here. Begin where you have begun, and you will be standing in it by the first thaw. Clara made a note. How far north? Come and look. And Ada walked her to the spot, and she did not hand the girl the answer. She showed her where the soil changed and let her find it with her own fingers, the way the old woman had once let her find the grain in the stone. Will you show me the rest? Clara asked. Not help me. Show me. Ada looked at this girl, the girl who had made the right choice in the worst moment of all. The girl who had kept her own quiet record since the very beginning, who knelt now in the spring mud with her father's hard-won words in her head, and her own questions driving the spade. Yes, Ada said, and they went to work. The passage that Clara built that summer was smaller than the one her teacher had built. First efforts always are, but it was sound, and it was well made, and it held. She improved it the next year from what she had learned in the first. She added a 3rd tier to the shelves that raised the capacity without widening the footprint. She adjusted the angle of the air shafts in a way that Ada, when she saw it, had to admit she had never thought of herself. The girl never stopped digging, and in the valley below the White Mountains, in a small town that had come so very close to a different kind of ending, the name Crane came to be spoken again. Spoken the way it had always deserved to be spoken, with the particular weight given to those who do the right thing before anyone is watching, and who build something that holds long after they are gone. As for the woman herself, she did not become a figure that the town pointed to or told stories about in hushed and reverent tones. That was never what she had wanted. That was never what any of it had been for. She grew older on that same land. She kept the passage in good repair. She taught the girl, and then she taught the children the girl brought to her. And the work passed on, hand to hand, the way real things do, quietly, without ceremony. On the cold nights, she would sometimes go down into the passage alone, with a single lantern, the way she had on the night the wall first groaned its warning. And she would lay her hand flat against the timber of the wall, and she would knock 3 times, soft. Not for the dead man who had begun it, not for the mother who had carried his name, not even for the husband the winter had taken, whose loss had driven her down into the earth in the first place. She knocked for the work, because the work deserved to know that it was finished, that it had held, that it had kept someone warm. And every winter after, when the snow came down over the valley and the cold pressed in at every door, there was a fire, and it was warm, and it was enough.